Hello, it's Sarah from Roadworthy. Welcome back. Sunny, spring, mowed the lawn, and my other big project was to repaint my bathroom cabinets because they were, just peeling and chipped and, from water moisture damage and. So took those down, sanded, did some, spackling on areas that were, there's one particular door that really gets the moisture damage. My husband can make a bit of a mess in the bathroom. Why when you're brushing your teeth or washing your face, do you have to get water all over the place? And you can see water dripping down the front of the cabinets. Anyway, let's not talk about that. I'm repairing the bathroom cabinets. And so we have all of the trim in my house, all the door frames, the baseboards, you can see here on the stairs, the kitchen cabinets, the bathroom cabinets, everything's white. And I had 3 cans of white paint in the basement. Semi-gloss, eggshell, satin. I figured the semi-gloss is probably what was used on the bathroom cabinets to try and help protect from the moisture. Well, you can't stir paint by hand as well as you can stir it in the store. And it doesn't match. I'll put a picture up. It doesn't match. So now I'm gonna have to paint. Anyway, it's okay. It's okay, but it's annoying. So at least now I know not to use that paint on all of the chips in the door frames and the baseboards because it doesn't match. So we're moving on to the can of satin next. Anyway, that's my week. Let's go on to the reading. So what did I read this week? So I listened to In the Upper Country by Kai Thomas. This was longlisted for the Governor General Award, I want to say, in 2019. No. 2000, I don't remember, recently, but not that recently. Anyway, this is historical fiction taking place in the 1880s. This is about a town in Canada, Dunsmore, that is inhabited by largely former American slaves. So this town is the terminus for the Underground Railroad, or a terminus, I should say. And so I was very intrigued to read this book for that history, right? As you can read lots of slave narratives and slave stories taking place in the American South. You can get a few of slavery in the Caribbean. You can get a few stories about the Underground Railroad, but I've not really read any stories about the connection to Canada. Totally makes sense, right? That American slaves would flee across the border, and the Canadian, well, I guess just say the British government, because Canada was a Commonwealth at this point. The Crown forbid the return of slaves to the United States once they made it into Canada, and they did not allow slave catchers to operate in Canada. So anyway, I thought it was just an interesting historical context to place a story. So the story is there are a couple of slaves who came up through the Underground Railroad, end up in Dunsmore, and one of them, an older woman, shoots and kills a slave catcher. So slaves were they were very valuable. And so slave catchers would be willing to take the risk to go into Canada and basically try and snatch someone and bring them back. Because if they could do it without getting caught, right, it would be very profitable for them. So the slave catcher gets killed. There in Dunsmore, there is a black run newspaper, and our narrator, Lucinda, is a young woman, and she can read and write. She's fairly educated, and she writes for the paper. And so she is asked to go to the jail to cash this woman's story before, she's potentially convicted of a crime of killing a man. And so when Lucinda goes to the prison to sort of get her story, she's like, well, I'm not going to tell you my story. We're gonna barter, and we're gonna trade stories back and forth. And they do. And basically this structure is a way for Kai Thomas to really tell a multi-generational family saga in an interesting structure and an interesting format, right? So they're each telling tales from their lives, and some of it involves their children or parents or, whatever. But again, it's a way to tell a family saga. So, I thought that was interesting. I was entertained. I was sanding cabinets and painting, while listening away. So it did the job. The writing was fine. Like, everything was fine about this. I wasn't blown away, but I can't really put my finger on why. There again, the structure, the historical time frame, the characterization was good. I'm not entirely sure why I wasn't gripped more by this book than on face value it would seem that I would have. And so I also read Tracking the Caribou Queen by Margaret Macpherson. This was a buddy read with Lindy over at Magpie Reads. And we were both recommended this book by Sean, the book maniac. And he has an interview with Margaret Macpherson on his channel. So I will link that down below. But Lindy and I both read this. I enjoyed it. For me, actually, probably the most interesting aspect of this book was listening to Lindy talk about how Margaret Macpherson's experiences in some ways parallel Lindy's experiences. So Margaret Macpherson grew up in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, and her dad was the principal of the school there that had a hostel for Indigenous kids. So, it was a residential school. And so she talks about growing up, talking about a lot of the systemic racism, and sort of how that culminated in her own internal biases, and how as she grew older she learned to sort of recognize those and question those. So it's interesting, she has stories talking about some of her Indigenous friends, and how those relationships were sort of secret, and she had, you know, various experiences with Indigenous people, interesting experiences with her siblings growing up, her parents. One of the things that I really liked in this book was the descriptions of Yellowknife, and the ice road to bring in supplies in the wintertime. You know, you had to wait for the water to freeze to bring in supplies. In just her descriptions of Old Town and New Town, and it did send me to Google to look at pictures of Yellowknife, just because it just her descriptions of it just were vivid. Some of the things, it starts when she's pretty small when they move to Yellowknife. She's not yet school age. And it ends with her graduating high school and leaving Yellowknife. But I love some of the early stories where they're living in the hotel in town, and there's some of the folks who go to the bar all the time. There's a woman, the Caribou Queen, who's an Indigenous woman who is a prostitute, living in the hotel, and sort of all these sort of seedy things going on, and you as an adult can tell these are seedy things going on, not necessarily something you want your children around, but how as kids they had no idea, you know, what was happening. So, you know, lots of interesting little snippets of life in Yellowknife in the 60s and 70s largely. So enjoyed that. So thank you, Lindy. And then I just finished yesterday Swanna in Love. Ooh, there we go, by Jennifer Belle. I'm going to go ahead and put this down because it's a shiny library copy. But Swanna is 14 at the beginning of this novel and is at summer camp. And she is on the bus headed back to her hometown, New York City, and she's told by the counselors to get off the bus that her mother is picking her up. Her mother picks her up 6 hours late. And then they pick up her younger brother, Madding, who is 8. And they go to a artist colony in Vermont, with her mother's most recent boyfriend. So they get to the artist colony. Children aren't allowed. He's not approved to have guests. So the kids end up sleeping in the bed of a pickup truck outside. Anyway, all kinds of like inanity ensues. Her mother is clearly rather irresponsible, and self-absorbed. It's almost like she's that friend in high school who suddenly gets a boyfriend and has no time for anybody else. And Swanna is oftentimes the one worrying about Madding. You know, is he going to be warm enough? Does he have food? You know. And so in some ways she is the adult, but yet she also has actions that clearly she's 14 years old. And there's actually a scene at the local diner where the waitress gets confused on who's the mother and who's the daughter, right? So that kind of says it all right there. And that's probably about the first half, maybe a third of the book. And then Swanna goes to the bowling alley and meets Dennis, who is a 42-ish year old physician. And she decides to seduce him. And, you know, so she ends up, you know, having sex with him and, you know, spending the night at his house, and all these things happen, and he's making plans, you know, I'm going to visit you in New York, and, you know, all these things. And she's desperately just wanting to get back to New York. So she's calling her dad, can you come get me? Maddie and I are sleeping in the back of a truck. And it turns out he's busy moving out permanently into his own apartment, and he has a new girlfriend too. So no, he doesn't have time to come pick her up. And so what's interesting about this book is, yes, there's a lot of humor on the surface. And the humor in some ways reminds me of Big Swiss, if you've read that book. Now, the humor in that book kind of annoyed me. Somehow this one didn't annoy me, and I'm not quite sure why, but there is a lot of humor on the surface. But underneath, you can see Swanna just desperately wanting some adult to please care for her and love her and think of her first. She, you know, you find out, and she's constantly pining for New York. New York is the best thing ever. She just wants to get back to New York, which, you know, is sort of a metaphor for sort of how getting back to how things used to be. You know, as the story goes on, you find out that her parents made a decision to get divorced and sent the kids off to summer camp. And so you could tell she's just wanting to go back to how things used to be, you know, before things fell apart. There's a lot of really outlandish events with Dennis, and in the flap of the book, they describe this as, in turns hilarious and wildly shocking, Swanna in love will keep your feathers ruffled and the pages gliding by. Yes, the pages did glide by. And there's a lot of scenes with her sexuality that seem like, really? A 14-year-old kid is doing this? But I think what Jennifer Belle does well is, because of all the stuff that happened with her mother at the beginning of the book, and some of her just bravado and gutsiness, you know, you see it there, so that when Dennis comes along and she starts doing these also pretty bold things, it somehow feels believable. And so I think that's the shocking part, you know, and again, acknowledging that a 14-year-old girl might have, you know, sexual desires. I think that's supposed to be the shocking part. You know, it's compared to Lolita, obviously, an inverse Lolita, but, you know, it does not have the feel of Lolita at all. I'm not going to say anything about the ending other than she does get back to New York. You know, you get the sense that she's smart, that she's just sort of unmoored a little bit here, but you do get the vibe that she is gonna pull it together here, and be okay. So, you know, I was intrigued enough by this book to take a look at Jennifer Belle's backlist. Was this great? No. I mean, I'd give it like a 3.5, 3 3/4 stars, you know? It was worth reading and I enjoyed it, but, you know, not something that I'm probably gonna remember in a couple weeks. Is that fair? That's fair. So I've got still Gods of the Upper Air going along. Picked up and started Chanel Miller's Know My Name. Just started that last night. And I am listening to, and probably 60% of the way through, Shelley Parker Chan's She Who Became the Sun, which is the first in a fantasy duology that's a retelling of the establishment of the Ming Dynasty. So I'm enjoying it. It's definitely a nice like break from these two. So that's what I got going on. And you know, the weather is going to be nothing but great next week. So I've got some hiking planned. Clearly I'm going to do some painting, more painting. And I'm a little bit thinking it's time to clean the oven, especially now that I can open the doors and the windows and stuff. So that might be on my list this coming week. Woohoo! It just doesn't stop around here. So anyway, hope you all are doing well, and catch you next time. See ya.